Hey guys, so I know I posted the Zoom meeting kind of last minute yesterday, so I made this video to go over the lecture. I only had a couple people show up. So there are a couple things. You guys don't have a lot of assignments for this week, but there are a couple things I did want to go over. First thing, kind of jumping back to the Missouri Compromise. And we've talked about the Missouri Compromise a good bit, kind of what it means, the implications of adding more states out west. Are they going to become slave states? Or are they going to become free states? And this, debate between our Congress even heightens after the Mexican-American War, and the United States has now acquired more land and more land that can be used for farming. And we've seen massive migrations out west that we talked about last week, with the Oregon Trail or the California Gold Rush. And now there's actually significant American populations in places like California and Texas and Oregon. And, the debate arises, what kind of states are these going to become as these populations start to apply for statehood? What's going to happen? So, California wants to join the Union. A lot of people living in California, and it's important to remember why people in these territories want to apply for statehood. Because if you're just living out in one of these unorganized territories, and you're not recognized as a state, well, you don't have any representation within the federal government. So you also don't have any ability to vote for the president, anything like that, because remember, the Electoral College does that, not us. But nonetheless, you can't have any representatives in the federal government. Your state government is non-existent. You really don't have anything in place to, run the state effectively or run the territory effectively. And so you want to apply for statehood so you can draft a state constitution and you can get admitted into the United States. Therefore, you can then have representation within our federal government. So California wants to join the Union, and they want to join as a free state, but there's a problem with that because if we look back, let me get it to go back here. If we look back to the Missouri Compromise, that 3630 line right there was supposed to extend all the way across the United States, or now is supposed to extend all the way across the United States because the United States has acquired all that land from Mexico. And so California obviously has a big chunk of land that falls south of that 3630 line. So negotiations start to take place, and we get the Compromise of 1850. So similar to the Compromise of 1820 or the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay developed both of these. He's known as the great compromiser in American history, a lot of times doing these negotiations between North and South. Remember, he was a big part of the Missouri Compromise. He helped avert the nullification crisis under Jackson, and now he's going to come up with another compromise as California wants to join the Union. So California could enter as a free state, but the North would have to enforce a fugitive slave law. So there's really five main provisions of five main acts of the Compromise of 1850. The two most notable are California got to join as a free state and the fugitive slave law, but also there's three other laws. It organized the boundaries between Texas and New Mexico, organized the Utah Territory and its boundaries, and abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. So the two most important really being California as a free state and the fugitive slave law. And the fugitive slave law is very important because what ends up happening here is the fugitive slave law was not necessarily new. The fugitive slave law came about in the 1790s, a long time before this, around 60 years before the Compromise of 1850. But the fugitive slave law is pretty much what it sounds like. And this fugitive slave law, or Fugitive Slave Act, whatever you want to call it, you'll see different names for it. But what it meant is that if an escaped slave from, say, Virginia, escaped to or fled to New York, well, the New York authorities were supposed to apprehend that slave and send them back down to Virginia. And we'll actually read an account of this happening when you guys get back from Thanksgiving, of a man who, had escaped to Boston, lived as a free man for 2 years, um, had started a family and everything, but under this new Fugitive Slave Act after 1850, the North had to enforce the act because largely it went unenforced until 1850. So that's the main thing here, is now they have to enforce it. It was already in place. Most northern states ignored it, but now with this compromise, they are required to enforce it. And it's going to make a lot of northerners upset because essentially, they have abolished slavery in their state, but they still have to abide by slavery and send slaves back to their masters in the South. So, there's a big problem with that, and this kind of even raises more questions about the abolitionist movement and gains more momentum for the abolitionist movement, because now these southern states are requiring us to kind of abide by their slave laws, by us having to, honor these laws and make these people go back to their masters in the South, go back to slavery. Also, New Mexico and Utah could use popular sovereignty. So I'm going to talk about popular sovereignty a lot in this lecture, and I've mentioned it before, but popular sovereignty is leaving it up to the people to vote. We still have things like this today, whether it's a referendum, on taxes or what have you. It's just go ahead and leave it up to the people to decide the policy. No politician nobody in the General Assembly or Congress is going to make the call, leaving it up to the people. So that's the basis of popular sovereignty, letting the people of the territory vote whether or not they want to allow slavery. Okay, I already talked about that. So I know I've used this expression before, but really the compromise is nothing but a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. In hindsight's 2020, and we understand, that ultimately the Civil War is going to happen. But you have to kind of understand that, they're trying to negotiate with one another. I mean, things are really divided between North and South, and they're only going to become more divided leading up to the Civil War. So it calmed tensions for a little bit, kind of cooled things off, but still it really didn't address the problem. And, North and South were not going to get along until this real issue of slavery had been, determined. And I mean, ultimately it had to be abolished, and the South was not willing to do that at this time. I mean, they would forcibly have to be, conquered in order to give up slavery. So, however, it was a clear issue that slavery was causing mass hostility between North and South. Again, the abolitionist movement is gaining momentum in the industrial North as news is spreading, population increasing, and the South still is kind of lagging behind the North, not becoming industrial, still just practicing a lot of farming, and depended on a lot of forced human labor. The South didn't really embrace the Industrial Revolution like the North did. Didn't use machines and mechanization to really replace that forced human labor. They already had slaves in place. Why would they spend the money to try to convert over to machinery? And so the South again lags behind, and this will be significant when we talk about the Civil War, because the South just doesn't have the industry, it doesn't have factories in order to really fight what will be the world's first industrial war. So violence erupts in Kansas. It's known as Bleeding Kansas. So really a small civil war kind of breaks out in the Kansas Territory. So as Kansas and Nebraska were both north of that Missouri Compromise line, but it was decided that popular sovereignty would determine slavery in the area as it became a state, or as they applied for statehood. So what ends up happening is outsiders, whether they were free soilers from the north trying to sway Kansas to become a free state, or whether they were pro-slavery politicians or advocates coming from the south to try to make Kansas be a slave state, a lot of outside people flocked to Kansas in order to try to sway the election one way or the other. And two rival governments are actually set up in the Kansas Territory. We have the Lecompton city, which is claimed as the capital, or the pro-slavery capital, and then we have Topeka, which was considered the anti-slavery capital. So we have two competing governments within the territory, both claiming to be the legit one, and of course violence breaks out in between these two factions, in between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery. And I don't believe we'll have time to necessarily read about him, but there was a man named John Brown. We'll talk about him in his raid on Harper's Ferry, where he tried to storm the U.S. Armory and arm a bunch of slaves in Virginia. But before he did that, he did go to Kansas, and he is a abolitionist, but he's a very radical abolitionist in the sense that he goes and gets a few of these pro-slavery politicians and takes them out in their yards and beheads them in front of their families. So, I mean, things have gotten pretty radical. That's an extreme example, but still people are killing each other over this issue in Kansas. And violence was not just happening out on the frontier. Actually, in the congressional or the Senate floor, we actually see violence break out between Preston Brooks of South Carolina, who radically opposed the abolitionist movement, and you have Charles Sumner, who was delivering an anti-slavery speech in Washington, D.C. Well, Preston Brooks didn't take too kindly to Sumner's speech against slavery, and he takes his cane. He kind of waits for a few people to leave the Senate floor, but he takes his cane and starts beating the crap out of Charles Sumner there on the Senate floor. I mean, just, beating him pretty rough. And you see in this picture here, this is a political cartoon of, violence just erupting on the Senate floor. And Charles Sumner is beat pretty badly. I mean, he's got black eyes, his head's all bloody, because Preston Brooks just didn't agree with his anti-slavery speech. And so you can see exactly how bad things are kind of getting. We have violence and killings taking place in Kansas. We have, fighting actually amongst our politicians on the Senate floor. And so the last thing I'm going to wrap up with for this week, and we'll kind of dive more into this when you guys get back to, but is the political parties and slavery. So the Republican Party forms in the 1850s, and it was mostly anti-slavery. Not every Republican was an abolitionist, but nonetheless, they controlled a lot of the northern politics. And then we have the Democrats, who controlled the South. That was Andrew Jackson's party. Remember how popular he was amongst the South. You have the Whig Party, which will kind of die out or pretty much be done by the end of the Civil War. Remember, they had broken away from Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party to try to create kind of a rival party against Andrew Jackson, but they're kind of losing favor, and they are divided over slavery within their party. But we have some smaller parties as well. We have the Know Nothing Party, which was a nativist party, really in places like New York and Boston, and it was really anti-immigration party. Their thing was to value American citizens over immigrants. They didn't think immigrants should be allowed to hold certain political offices, didn't believe that immigrants should be allowed to have certain jobs, and that, American citizens should be, considered for jobs over immigrants. But really the basis of this is kind of an anti-immigration. And these guys, were violent. That's why they got their name. They commit acts of violence against immigrants, whether that was, burning down a, Catholic Church of the Irish, or beating up immigrants as they got off the boat into New York. But when they were questioned by the authorities, they would always just claim that I know nothing, kind of pleading the fifth and never giving up any information. So that's why they were called the Know Nothing Party. But the main thing there was anti-immigration. We have the Free Soil Party, and Abraham Lincoln kind of follows this idea when he gets elected. He's a Republican, but he follows this idea of the Free Soil Party, which wanted to ban the new states out west from allowing slavery. So the states out west would not become slave states; it would be free states. And then you had the Liberty Party, which people like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison would be a part of. But the Liberty Party wanted to end slavery everywhere in the United States, wanted to totally abolish slavery. And so that wraps up this lecture for this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and fill out those guided notes. email those to me. Let me know you got them done. And I'm thinking about giving some extra credit for those notes if you email them to me before Monday. So I hope you guys have a good Thanksgiving, and I will see you next week.